They thought no one could hear her. A 6-year-old girl trapped behind smiles and silence, whispering her pain to a doll no one believed was real. Her father said it was love, but her eyes told a different story. And no one listened. No one. Until he did. A retired canine German shepherd, scarred but loyal, and a cop haunted by the past. What they uncovered will break your heart and restore your faith. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe in second chances, in love that protects, not hurts, hit that subscribe button. Because this story will never leave you. It was a late November afternoon in Lakemont, a quiet town nestled in the northern stretch of Michigan, where pine trees stood like ancient guardians, and the air always smelled faintly of wood smoke. The wind carried a bitter edge, whispering across the narrow streets lined with clapboard houses and long frozen bird baths. Snow had fallen earlier that morning, coating every roof and branch in crisp white, though patches of mud peeked through on well-worn sidewalks. The sky was beginning to bruise with twilight. Officer Jonah Reeves had just poured a cup of lukewarm coffee when the dispatch call came in. Unit 14, we've got a 911 call from a child. Female, sounds around 6 years old, still on the line. Address is 74 Willow Lane. She keeps whispering the same phrase. Jonah set his mug down slowly, a flicker of unease in his chest. What's she saying? The operator's voice came back, quieter this time. She says, Daddy said it was love. That phrase made Jonah freeze. At 39, Jonah had seen his share of darkness, both on duty and off. A tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp gray eyes and hands like old leather, he was known around town as calm and dependable. But his personal life was anything but steady. His wife, Carla, had passed away 6 years ago in a car crash caused by a drunk driver, an event that shattered more than just his heart. Since then, he'd grown quieter, a man who bore his sadness in silence, finding more comfort in routine and his loyal partner than in people. His partner now sat in the passenger seat of the cruiser, ears perked, alert as ever. Ranger. A German shepherd, 9 years old, black and tan with a speckled muzzle and one cloudy eye, an old injury from a meth lab explosion during his final service year. Retired from canine duty, Ranger had been reassigned as a therapy dog, but Jonah had adopted him instead. Ranger was more than a dog to Jonah. He was the last piece of a world that had burned down, the only soul who never looked at Jonah with pity, only loyalty. Ranger got his name years ago from the first boy he ever rescued, a 5-year-old who'd wandered into the forest near Traverse City and was lost for 2 nights in the cold. When they found the boy curled beside the dog, he was barely conscious, and when the EMT lifted him onto a stretcher, the child looked back at the dog and whispered, "He's my Ranger." He stayed. The name stuck, and it fit. Now Ranger's ears twitched again as Jonah slid into the driver's seat. "Let's go see what this little girl's trying to tell us," Jonah muttered, turning the key. Willow Lane wasn't far, just past the town's edge, where the houses grew larger, yards more private, and neighbors stopped waving hello. Number 74 was a 2-story colonial with dark blue shutters and a wraparound porch. There was nothing unusual about it at first glance. A plastic snowman stood smiling on the lawn, holiday lights blinked gently in the window, but Jonah's stomach tightened. And Ranger growled, low, soft, a warning. Jonah stepped out into the cold. Paul Bennett answered the door after 2 knocks. He was in his early 40s, medium height, neatly combed brown hair and wire-frame glasses. Dressed in a flannel shirt tucked into jeans, he smiled in a way that was almost too perfect. "Officers, thank God. I think there's been some confusion," he chuckled. "My daughter Lily, she's 6, probably played with the phone. You know how kids are." Paul spoke with the ease of a man used to being believed. His tone was polite, his stance non-threatening. But Jonah had seen too many polished masks to be reassured by the varnish. "We'd like to speak with her if you don't mind," Jonah said. "Of course. She's upstairs playing." He turned and called, "Lily, some nice police officers are here to say hello." They waited. Then came the softest sound bare feet on polished stairs. Lily appeared, holding a threadbare doll with tangled yarn hair. She wore fleece pajamas covered in tiny reindeer and had long, dark brown hair that hung in loose knots. Her cheeks were pale, her lips a touch too dry. But it was her eyes, too wide, too quiet, that caught Jonah's breath. She looked not at him, not at her father, but at Ranger. Ranger took a step forward, nose twitching. The little girl's hand tightened around the doll, then she bent slightly, whispered something to it, and patted Ranger's head gently when he drew near. "This is Lacey," she murmured, voice paper thin. Jonah knelt. "Hi, Lily. I'm Officer Jonah. This is Ranger. Did you call us today?" Lily hesitated, glanced up toward her father, then back down. "I think so." Her voice trembled like a leaf. Jonah noticed the small bruise on her wrist, half hidden by her pajama sleeve. Paul quickly added, "She's been having nightmares lately. It's been a rough couple weeks. I was thinking of getting her some help, maybe a child counselor." Jonah stood. "Mind if we take a look around? Just routine." Paul didn't flinch. "Sure, be my guest." The house was immaculate, too immaculate. Toys perfectly lined up, a single framed picture on the mantel, Paul and Lily at a park. No pictures of a mother, no drawings taped to the fridge, no finger paints, no clutter. In the hallway, Ranger paused. He sniffed near the baseboards. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Jonah saw it. Ranger was alert, focused, the kind of posture he used to take when something was off. Back in the foyer, Lily hadn't moved. She sat on the stairs, cradling her doll. Jonah knelt again, softening his voice. "If you ever need anything, Lily, you can call me, or Ranger. We'll come." Lily didn't nod, didn't speak, but her hand reached out and brushed the top of Ranger's ear. As Jonah stepped outside, the sky was darkening to violet. The air had gone still. He looked back, and through the upstairs window, a small figure stood watching, clutching a doll like a lifeline. The door clicked shut behind them with a soft finality. Jonah stood just inside the entryway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim lighting of the Bennett home. The house was warm, but not in the way that invited comfort. It was the kind of warmth that came from habit, not hard air that had sat still too long behind locked windows. Ranger sniffed at the hem of Jonah's coat before stepping forward, his claws clicking lightly against the hardwood floors as he scanned the space with a low but deliberate pace. Paul Bennett offered a casual laugh, leading them further inside. "Really, officers, I apologize for the trouble. Lily's always been a bit imaginative. I've caught her talking to her doll more times than I can count. I'm sure she didn't mean to cause a scene." He gestured toward the living room, a space that looked lifted straight from a catalog. Neutral tones, dust-free surfaces, 2 throw pillows perfectly placed on the beige couch. A bookshelf lined with self-help books and parenting guides. A framed photo of Paul and Lily at a pumpkin patch stood on the mantel. But even in the photograph, Lily's smile didn't reach her eyes. Jonah remained standing, arms loosely crossed. "We're just here to make sure everything's all right." "Of course," Paul nodded. "I completely understand. Lily's upstairs. She'll be down in a second." Jonah's eyes flicked toward the staircase just as the sound of small feet descending began. The rhythm was hesitant. Then, Lily appeared at the top step, her small frame wrapped in fleece pajamas. She clutched her doll, Lacey, tighter than before, her knuckles pale against the fabric. Lacey was a soft-bodied doll with yarn hair and stitched eyes, one of which had begun to unravel, leaving a loose black thread like a falling tear. Jonah watched as Lily made her way down the steps. Her feet were bare despite the cold. She didn't speak, didn't look up, and settled herself quietly at the bottom of the stairs, sinking onto the lowest step. She curled into herself, the way small animals do when trying to disappear. Ranger approached her slowly, body low and calm, tail slightly wagging. He had a way of knowing when to soften himself, and Jonah trusted that instinct more than most human judgment. Lily glanced toward him briefly before whispering something to Lacey. Then, with quiet purpose, she leaned forward and placed her hand on Ranger's head, fingers brushing against the scar above his clouded eye. Paul chuckled from the hallway. "She likes animals more than people sometimes. I suppose it's easier for kids." Jonah's gaze didn't leave the girl. He crouched nearby, careful not to get too close. "Hey there, Lily. I'm glad you came down to see us." She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them, still petting Ranger gently. Jonah's breath caught. The image stirred something sharp in him, memories of Carla, his late wife, in the weeks leading to her decision to leave the house after months of psychological abuse from a former employer she'd never reported. Jonah had been too caught up in work to notice the signs. By the time she admitted the truth, the damage had burrowed deep. What haunted him most was the way she sat, just like Lily did now, folded into herself, afraid of being too much, yet desperate to be seen. "I'd like to talk with Lily for just a minute," Jonah said, standing. Paul raised an eyebrow but kept his smile in place. "Of course. She probably won't say much, but go ahead." Jonah moved slowly to sit on the step a few feet away from the girl. Ranger remained between them, his presence as much a bridge as a shield. "Lily," Jonah said softly, "is there something you wanted to tell us? Something that made you call today?" Lily stared at Ranger's fur. Her lips parted, and she whispered, barely audible. "Lacey said I should." Jonah nodded slowly. "That was very brave." Paul cleared his throat. "Lily, sweetie, remember what we talked about? Sometimes dreams feel real. That's all this was, right?" Lily didn't move. Jonah watched closely. Her body tensed ever so slightly at her father's words. Her hand gripped the doll's neck tighter. He stood and turned to Paul. "Would you mind if we spoke to her alone for just a minute?" Paul hesitated, then laughed. "Well, I guess that's fine. I'll just be in the kitchen. I've got dinner on the stove. You'll see. It's all perfectly ordinary." He stepped away, the sound of cupboard doors opening filling the space. Jonah crouched again. "Lily, you're not in trouble. I just want to know if you feel safe." She turned her head slightly, enough that Jonah could see her face in profile. There was a small cut just above her hairline, half hidden beneath her bangs. "I miss Mommy," she whispered. "Lacey remembers her. She had a soft voice. She smelled like lemon cake." Jonah didn't push. "I bet she had a nice smile, too." Lily nodded, eyes wet. "She's asleep. Daddy said forever." Ranger leaned his head into her lap, and the little girl clung to his fur like a life vest. Jonah's voice caught in his throat, but he kept it steady. "Okay, Lily. Thank you for telling me." Rising, he made his way to the kitchen. Paul was stirring something at the stove, a bland-smelling chicken broth. "She tell you anything useful?" Paul asked. Jonah didn't answer the question directly. "She misses her mom." Paul sighed. "Of course she does. Sarah was sweet, but she wasn't strong. Just couldn't handle being a parent, I guess. One day she left a note and vanished. Haven't heard a word since. I've tried to keep Lily safe and happy. That's all I care about." Jonah nodded, but inside the unease in his gut swelled. "Mind if we stop by again later this week? Maybe with someone from Child Services?" Jonah said calmly. Paul blinked. "I don't see why that would be necessary. Everything's fine here." "It's routine, Paul." The man didn't smile this time. "Sure, whatever helps you sleep." Jonah walked back to Lily. "We'll be back soon, all right?" Lily looked up, and for the first time her eyes met his directly. "Will Ranger come too?" "Always," Jonah said. Outside, Jonah helped Ranger into the cruiser and started the engine. The wind had picked up. Snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the streetlights. Jonah didn't speak for several minutes until he finally muttered, "That man's lying." Ranger gave a soft whine, then lay his head on the seat, eyes trained on the house as they pulled away. It was nearly midnight when Jonah Reeves parked his cruiser outside his modest house on Aspen Drive. The wind had grown harsher, snow falling heavier now, blanketing the world in white silence. The streets of Lakemont were empty except for the hum of distant porch lights and the occasional bark of a dog that hadn't yet been called in. But Jonah's mind wasn't in his neighborhood. It was still at 74 Willow Lane. Inside his home, the fire was low in the hearth and the scent of pine and leather lingered faintly in the air. Ranger padded in ahead of him, shook the snow from his coat, and walked a few tight circles before settling near the window, still alert. He hadn't stopped watching that house, not since they left. Jonah had noticed it before, a tension in the way Ranger carried himself. The old dog's instincts were rarely wrong. Jonah kicked off his boots and shrugged out of his coat, then crossed the room to his desk and flipped open his laptop. His fingers hovered for a moment before he typed, "Sarah Bennett, Lakemont, Michigan. Search. Nothing. No recent activity, no hospital records, no employment in the last 3 years, not even a social media trail." He tried Lily Bennett next. Again, no school enrollment, no pediatrician listed within the county. The girl didn't exist on paper, at least not recently. Frustrated, Jonah leaned back in his chair. He glanced toward Ranger, who was now pacing in front of the window again, tail stiff. The image of Lily's eyes as she whispered, "Mommy went to sleep forever," echoed again. Not Mommy left, not Mommy went away. Something darker. The next morning, Jonah returned to Willow Lane, this time alone in civilian clothes, under the pretense of a neighborhood wellness survey the department sometimes used to quietly check on families. He wore a charcoal sweater and jeans, blending in easily with the suburban calm. Paul Bennett answered the door just as politely as the day before. "Officer Reeves," Paul said, smile intact. "Or I guess you're not in uniform today, something I can help you with?" "Just a community outreach form," Jonah said easily, holding up a clipboard with blank papers. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" Paul hesitated a moment longer than polite people usually do. "Sure, yeah, come on in. Lily's still asleep, I think." Jonah stepped into the house again, taking his time to scan every detail. Nothing had changed. Same spotless surfaces, same perfect stillness. It reminded him of those model homes they show during open houses. No fingerprints, no coffee cups, no evidence of daily life. "Did you say you were Lily's sole guardian?" Jonah asked, pen poised. Paul smiled again, but it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. "Yes, since Sarah left, 3 years ago. Just walked out one morning. Left a note. May I ask if you filed a missing person report?" Paul looked away, just for a second. "I didn't think it would help. She left by choice. She wasn't well, mentally. Always anxious, overwhelmed. She said she needed to find herself." Jonah made a small note. "And your neighbors? Did any of them know her well?" Paul chuckled awkwardly. "We keep to ourselves, mostly. You know how people are. Always judging. Especially when you're raising a child on your own." Jonah thanked him and left shortly after, eyes scanning the backyard as he walked toward the cruiser parked a few houses down. He made a mental note to return without knocking. That afternoon, he paid a quiet visit to one of the neighbors, a retired postmaster named Evelyn Marsden. Evelyn was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and nosy in the most useful way. She wore a thick wool shawl over her shoulders and kept a pair of binoculars on her kitchen table for bird watching. "Sarah Bennett?" she said, frowning. "Can't say I ever saw her. Saw the husband, Paul. Quiet. Too quiet, honestly. Never came to the block barbecues. Lily, though, sweet girl, always with that doll. Doesn't play with the other kids, not once." "Do you recall ever seeing Sarah outside?" Jonah asked. Evelyn shook her head. "Not once in 3 years. Strange now that I think about it." Later that evening, Jonah returned again. This time, he parked behind the row of trees behind the backyard fence and approached from the side. Ranger followed quietly, ears high, moving like a shadow across the snow. The fence was tall, but not impossible. Jonah boosted himself up and over, landing with a quiet thud in the backyard of 74 Willow Lane. Ranger sniffed around immediately, drawn to something near the corner of the yard. His head dropped low, posture shifting. He had caught a scent. Jonah followed. There, beneath the snow-dusted garden trellis, half obscured by ivy, was a small wooden structure set into the ground. A storm door, old but reinforced with a heavy padlock. A cellar. Ranger pawed at the snow beside it, growling low in his throat. Jonah knelt, brushing away the frost with his gloves. The lock was new. Too new. He pressed his hand to the wooden door. It was cold, but something beneath it felt wrong. Still. Too still. He took a step back, eyes narrowed. "We'll be back," he muttered to Ranger. That night, as snow began falling again, Ranger lay curled near the fireplace. But when Jonah turned out the lights, Ranger didn't move to his usual place at the foot of the bed. Instead, he returned to the front door, sat stiff, and stared through the glass toward the horizon where Willow Lane lay buried in night. The next morning, the frost clung stubbornly to the windows of the Lakemont Police Department as the pale sun broke through a curtain of snow-laced clouds. Inside the small-town station, the hum of fluorescent lights and the low murmur of typing officers filled the air. It was a modest place, 3 desks, a coffee machine that hissed more than it brewed, and walls peppered with faded Community Watch posters. But today, it felt different. Jonah Reeves sat at his desk, his coat still on, watching as Lily Bennett colored quietly at the corner table he'd set up with scrap paper and crayons. He had brought her in under the pretense of letting her see where Ranger worked, hoping the neutral environment and distance from her father might coax her out of the shell she'd retreated into. He hadn't expected her to speak, but she had asked if Ranger would be there, and when the dog had climbed into the cruiser beside her, she had smiled. A small thing, but real. Ranger now lay beside her, head resting on his paws, one ear flicking every now and then as the crayon scratched paper. The big shepherd didn't move when she leaned her weight gently against his side, and he didn't blink when she whispered to her doll. "Officer Reeves," came a soft voice behind him. Jonah turned to see Deputy Maylee Torres enter the bullpen, holding 2 cups of coffee. She was 33, Latina, with wide, warm eyes and a scar beneath her chin from her days in narcotics. Calm under pressure, quick to read people, one of the few he trusted without question. "She's the girl from the 911 call?" Maylee asked, setting the coffee on his desk. Jonah nodded. "Paul Bennett's daughter." Maylee glanced over at Lily. "She looks too quiet." "Yeah," Jonah murmured. "That's what worries me." Lily continued her drawing, her small hand moving with determined strokes. She had chosen a red crayon for her shirt, a soft yellow for the dog beside her. Jonah waited, giving her time, resisting the urge to guide or question. Then, after several minutes, she slid the paper toward the edge of the table, nudged it forward, and went back to coloring as though nothing had happened. Jonah approached and knelt beside the table, picking up the page. The drawing was simple but raw, a little girl standing with a large German shepherd beside her. The girl's eyes were drawn large and downcast. Her arms were around the dog's neck. Beside them stood a figure tall, angular, with wide, angry eyes and a mouth like a jagged lightning bolt. Over the figure's head was a scribble of dark crayon strokes. At the bottom, in shaky letters, were the words, "Lacey tells me the truth." Jonah stared at the picture for a long moment, then glanced at Lily. "Can you tell me about this?" Lily hugged her doll tighter and looked at the wall. "That's me," she said, almost inaudibly. "And that's Ranger. He's not afraid." "Afraid of what?" She didn't answer, but her hand reached out and gently touched Ranger's ear. Then she whispered to the dog, too softly for Jonah to hear. Maylee stepped closer and leaned down. "Hi, Lily. I'm Maylee. That's a really good drawing. You're very brave." Lily didn't respond directly, but her lips curved slightly, just barely, at the corners. Ranger responded by gently licking her hand. She giggled light and sudden. The sound startled even her. Jonah's chest tightened. That was the first real laugh they'd heard from her. "She hasn't had any medical checkups. No school. No one's seen her mom in 3 years, Jonah said, quietly enough that Lily wouldn't hear. "There's something off in that house, and I think this doll Lacey is how she talks, when she's too scared to use her own voice." Maylee tilted her head. "Then maybe we need to start listening to Lacey." A knock came from the hallway. Officer Greg Hanley, a stocky, balding man with an easy smirk, popped his head in. "You've got someone from Family and Child Services in the lobby. Said you called." "Perfect timing," Jonah said. He stood and motioned Maylee to stay with Lily. In the station's front room stood Elise Porter, a social worker from the county office. She was in her late 40s, tall and reed-thin, dressed in a navy peacoat with streaks of gray through her black hair and glasses that slid down the bridge of her nose. She carried a satchel full of manila folders and walked with a no-nonsense stride. "Elise," Jonah greeted her. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," she said, shaking off snow from her coat. "You said it was urgent?" "I think there's abuse, emotional at the very least. The mother's gone, but there's no paper trail. The daughter speaks in riddles, mostly through a doll, and the father, he's too perfect. House is too perfect. It feels staged." Elise took notes as he spoke, her expression unreadable. "What has the girl said?" Jonah handed her the drawing. She studied it in silence for a few moments, then folded it carefully and placed it into a folder. "Do you think she'd be willing to talk to me?" Jonah glanced toward the bullpen. "She doesn't talk to many people, but she talks to the dog." Elise nodded. "Then we let the dog stay." Back in the bullpen, Lily looked up as Jonah and Elise returned. Elise knelt, slow and careful. "Hi, Lily. My name is Elise. I work with kids. I help them when things feel scary." Lily blinked. Her grip on Lacey tightened. "Can I sit with you?" Elise asked. Lily didn't respond, but she didn't object either. Elise sat and pulled out a blank sheet of paper and some colored pencils. "I used to draw when I was scared," she said. "It helped me tell secrets I couldn't say." Lily stared at her a moment, then reached for a pencil. Ranger shifted closer, lying down between them, his body long and warm and steady. Elise didn't speak again. She waited, just like Jonah had. After a while, Lily passed her the new drawing. It was of a locked door. a dark staircase beneath it, and next to it, a heart cracked in half. Elise met Jonah's gaze across the room and gave a slow, solemn nod. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the frigid air as Jonah Reeves stood outside Lakemont General Hospital, the wind biting at the back of his neck. The building, though recently renovated, still bore the quiet fatigue of every hospital's sterile walls, cold tile floors, and the faint smell of antiseptic that never quite went away, the kind of place where pain lingered even after people left. He had driven here without thinking too much, acting on instinct. After reviewing the case file Elise had started on Lily Bennett, he'd felt that familiar itch at the base of his spine that something was still buried. Sarah Bennett hadn't simply left, no matter what Paul said, and Jonah was going to find out why. Inside, the nurse's station buzzed with clipped conversations and soft beeping monitors. Jonah approached a woman seated behind the counter, middle-aged with short salt and pepper hair, and a badge that read L. Templeton, Charge Nurse. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Officer Jonah Reeves from Lakemont PD. I'm looking for anyone who may have worked here around 5 years ago, specifically with a nurse named Sarah Bennett." Nurse Templeton looked up, skeptical. "Sarah? That name rings a bell. 1 second." She tapped a few keys, brows knitting as she searched the system. "She's not in our active staff. Left the hospital about 5 years back, quietly. Some of us wondered if something happened." She paused, glancing over her glasses. "There's one person who might remember more. Retired last year, Betty Harmon. She volunteers here sometimes in pediatrics. Sweet woman. Spends most of her time knitting hats for the preemies." 10 minutes later, Jonah sat in a quiet room near the pediatric wing across from Betty Harmon, a soft-spoken woman in her early 70s with tightly coiled white hair and kind, watery blue eyes. Her floral sweater was speckled with little bits of yarn, and her hands were gnarled from age but moved with precision as she crocheted. "Sarah Bennett," Betty repeated, setting her yarn aside. "She was one of the good ones. Quiet, tall, a little underweight if I remember right. Always wore a braid down her back. Brown hair, soft voice. She was gentle with the patients, especially the ones going through hard things at home. You could tell she understood." Jonah leaned forward slightly. "Did anything ever happen to her?" Betty's mouth tightened. "She started missing shifts, showed up once with bruises on her wrists, said she fell getting out of the shower. Then a week later, a split lip. Another time, her shoulder was swollen. She said it was a car door. I've been in nursing for over 30 years. I know when someone's lying to cover for someone else. We offered support, but she always said she was fine, said she just needed rest." Her eyes glistened now. "And then one day, she just vanished. No goodbye, no warning. She left her locker full, even left her badge in her scrub pocket." "Did she ever mention her daughter?" Betty nodded. "Little Lily. She was everything to Sarah. Always showed us pictures. Said she sang to her every night. The last week she was here, though, she didn't talk about her anymore." Jonah's stomach twisted. After thanking Betty and jotting down the information, he headed back to his cruiser, thoughts racing. Sarah had been scared. Someone had made her feel like disappearing was safer than asking for help. And Jonah had a good idea who that someone was. He drove straight to the station. Elise Porter was already there, reviewing Lily's file. "Jonah," she said, looking up as he entered, "I've been combing through hospital reports. No official missing persons file for Sarah. But I did find one ER visit from 5 years ago listed under a different last name. Maiden name, maybe. Sarah Whitlock. It lines up with the time Betty said she started showing signs of abuse." Jonah dropped into the chair beside her. Betty confirmed she was being hurt, covered it up. Then she disappeared. "Then we dig deeper," Elise said. That night the snow thickened. Jonah couldn't sleep. Ranger paced the living room, restless. He knew the dog well enough to recognize the signs. Something was bothering him. Just after midnight, Jonah bundled up, clipped on Ranger's leash, and walked him under the pale street lamps, snow crunching beneath their boots and paws. But Ranger tugged not toward the park or the station like usual. He pulled toward Willow Lane. Jonah's breath fogged in the cold as they reached the back fence of the Bennett property. He hadn't planned this, but something in the way Ranger stared at that house told him it was time. He hoisted himself over the fence again. Ranger followed, landing silently in the snow. The storm door to the cellar looked just as it had before, untouched. Locked tight. But this time, Ranger's reaction was different. He sniffed along the wall, then darted to the far right corner where a rusted shovel leaned against the house. Behind it, obscured by a broken flower pot and a stack of empty paint cans, was something strange, matted hair. Jonah crouched. There, wedged into the brick crevice of the wall, was a small clump of brown hair. Dried blood darkened the strands near the base. He pulled out a Ziploc bag from his pocket and carefully placed the sample inside. Then he looked at Ranger. "You knew, didn't you?" Ranger whined low in his throat. Jonah backed away slowly, eyes never leaving that cellar door. Whatever Paul was hiding, it wasn't just emotional abuse, something worse had happened there. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of bare trees as midnight crept into Lakemont. Snowflakes spiraled in the glow of street lamps, piling into silent white dunes across rooftops and driveways. Jonah Reeves sat in his cruiser 2 blocks away from 74 Willow Lane, his fingers wrapped tightly around a thermos of untouched coffee. Ranger lay beside him on the passenger seat, alert despite the hour, his golden brown eyes never straying far from the faint outline of the house they'd been watching all day. The unease had grown into a knot in Jonah's chest, tightening with every minute. After the blood-matted hair they'd recovered near the cellar, after Elise's confirmation that Sarah Bennett had used her maiden name in the ER, after Betty's haunted memories of bruises and whispered excuses, Jonah knew one thing for certain. Sarah hadn't walked away. She had been silenced. But it wasn't evidence that drew Jonah back to the Bennett home that night. It was instinct and Lily. Earlier that evening, she had clung to Ranger during her second visit to the station. Jonah had let her sit quietly in the corner of his office while he reviewed reports. Lily had barely spoken, but just before Paul arrived to pick her up, she'd leaned down and whispered into Ranger's ear. Her voice was tremulous, her lips barely moving. "Please help me," she had said. "Mommy didn't leave." Those 4 words looped in Jonah's head like a broken prayer. Now, as the cruiser's heater hummed gently and the world around them lay frozen, Jonah kept his eyes on the house. Nothing had moved for hours. All the lights were off, curtains drawn, just as they'd been every night. But then Ranger sat up sharply, ears pricking. Jonah followed his gaze. Through the frost-smeared windshield he saw movement, just a shadow, but enough to make his pulse spike. The curtain upstairs shifted. A dim light flickered behind it. Seconds later, the curtain snapped open, and Jonah saw her. Lily. Her face was pale, lips trembling, eyes rimmed red. She clutched her doll, Lacey, to her chest, and pressed her forehead to the glass. Then she disappeared. Jonah's hand moved instinctively to the gear shift. Suddenly, a loud yell cracked through the frozen air, muffled but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Another shout. Then a crash. A shadow passed behind the curtain, and then a second scream. Lily's. Jonah's foot slammed the gas. He tore down the street, headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Ranger barked beside him, claws scraping at the dashboard. The cruiser skidded slightly as Jonah turned into the driveway of 74 Willow Lane. Inside the house, chaos erupted. Through the front window, Jonah saw Paul Bennett no longer composed or neighborly. He was screaming, red-faced, clutching Lacey the doll in one hand, his other arm raised. Lily sobbed hysterically, trying to pull the doll back, but Paul shoved her to the floor. Ranger leapt forward before the car had stopped moving. He pressed against the door, whining, growling, pacing with urgency. Jonah threw the door open. He didn't knock. He kicked. The front door splintered as it flew inward. Jonah burst through, gun holstered but hand ready, shouting, "Police!" Paul froze mid-step, the doll dangling from his grip. He looked like a man unhinged, his hair wild, shirt half untucked, pupils dilated. "She's lying," he shouted. "She always lies, just like her mother." Lily curled into the corner by the stairs, shaking violently. Jonah strode forward, body low, calm but firm. "Drop it, Paul. Let go of the doll." Ranger growled beside him, a low warning sound. Paul blinked at the dog, then at Jonah. For a moment, he looked like he might lunge, but something in Ranger's stance, rigid, unmoving, ready broke whatever was left of his rage. Paul dropped Lacey with a thud. Jonah cuffed him without another word. "Elise," he barked into the radio clipped to his shoulder, "we need emergency child placement now." As officers arrived to take Paul into custody, Jonah turned to Lily. She hadn't moved. Her hands still trembled, face streaked with tears. Ranger padded to her, tail low. He nudged her hand gently with his snout. She looked at him, then collapsed against his side. Later, After paramedics had checked Lily for injuries and a social services rep arrived to escort her to a temporary care home, Jonah remained behind with Ranger, sweeping the property. They needed to find that cellar again, but this time, go in. In the backyard, snow had gathered thick over the storm doors. Jonah shoveled through it quickly. The lock was still there, but this time, he had bolt cutters. The doors creaked open with an eerie groan. Jonah clicked on his flashlight and descended the steps, Ranger at his side. The air grew colder with each step. The space below was unfinished concrete floor, exposed beams, and a faint mildew smell. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled neatly. Lily's clothes, Christmas, books, Sarah's. Jonah moved slowly, scanning the corners. Then Ranger stopped, nose to the ground. The dog pawed at the dirt near a stack of forgotten furniture. Jonah moved the broken table aside, then a trunk. Beneath them, the dirt looked disturbed darker, looser. He dug with his hands, breath catching. Inches down, his fingers brushed plastic. He pulled up the shattered half of a doll's arm, one that didn't match Lacey. Then something else. A piece of paper, crumpled and faded with time. He unfolded it carefully. A single word was written on it, in shaky penmanship. Sarah. Jonah exhaled slowly. Someone had tried to bury something here, evidence, or maybe a warning. He rose, his knees stiff, and looked down at Ranger. "You found it," he murmured. Ranger stood silent and still, eyes reflecting the light like twin embers in the dark. The morning after the arrest, a heavy stillness draped over Lakemont like the hush before a storm. Though the sun rose on schedule, its light felt muted, diffused through a sky smudged with dull grays and whites. The town, so often quiet, now buzzed softly with whispers. Rumors of the Bennett case spread police cruisers outside a nice house, the screaming, the doll, the little girl, and people began to glance more often at one another with uncertain eyes. At the station, Jonah stood outside the forensics lab, arms folded tightly across his chest. Elise Porter paced nearby, her boots tapping a soft rhythm on the tile. She looked tired more so than usual. Her normally precise bun was slipping, and the crow's feet beside her eyes had deepened from stress. But her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. "They just confirmed it." Jonah looked at her sharply. "The test?" She nodded. "The hair sample, the blood, both are a match. It's Sarah Bennett." Jonah exhaled slowly, jaw tightening. He turned and stared out the window at the parking lot dusted in fresh snow, the weight of the truth pressing down like winter's sky. Sarah Bennett, Lily's mother, was gone. Not missing, not wandering, gone. The traces of her were buried beneath the cellar of a house that pretended to be safe, beneath tidy hedges and clean carpets and family photos where she no longer existed. Elise stepped beside him. "We don't know where the rest of her is, Jonah, but this is enough." The judge signed off on formal charges against Paul, first-degree murder, concealment of a body, and child endangerment. "Good," Jonah muttered, but there was no satisfaction in it, only the ache of justice that came too late for one woman and nearly too late for her child. Down the hallway, Lily sat alone in a visitation room of the Lakemont Child Protective Center, legs tucked beneath her, head resting on her knees. Her bony arms wrapped tightly around Lacey, her battered doll. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the night Paul was arrested. Not to Elise, not to the nurses, not even to the kind, gray-haired woman assigned to care for her at the center. But when Jonah entered, and Ranger padded softly to her side, she lifted her head. Her eyes, rimmed red and half lost in grief, flicked toward the dog, and her fingers reached out. Ranger settled beside her without hesitation, resting his head gently on her lap. She leaned down, whispered something into his fur, and closed her eyes. It was the first time she'd looked at peace in days. Watching from the doorway, Jonah clenched his fists. He couldn't walk away, not now, not when she had no one else. "Let me take her," he said later that evening, sitting across from Elise in her cramped office. "At least temporarily. I know the paperwork. I've done short-term fosters before. She knows me. She trusts Ranger." Elise looked doubtful, then weary, then something softened in her gaze. "You live alone, you work full-time. You've never fostered a child this young? You'd need clearance, daily check-ins, training, supervision." "I'll do all of it," Jonah said, "whatever it takes." She leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're doing this because of guilt, for what happened to Carla, for not seeing the signs sooner." He didn't deny it. "Maybe, but that doesn't change what she needs. And she doesn't need a facility. She needs to sleep somewhere quiet, to eat dinner without looking over her shoulder, to hear someone say she's safe, and mean it." Elise was silent for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone. 3 hours later, Jonah unlocked the front door to his home, holding a small duffel bag in one hand and Lily's thin fingers in the other. Ranger trotted ahead, tail swishing gently, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Inside, Jonah had prepared the guest room, a soft blue comforter, nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, shelves he'd hurriedly filled with picture books. The house still smelled faintly of pine cleaner and wood smoke. Lily stepped in cautiously, eyes flicking around. She didn't speak. "You can sleep here," Jonah said gently. "Bathroom's down the hall. Kitchen's always open. You don't need to ask." She clutched Lacey tighter, eyes wary. Jonah crouched beside her. "Ranger'll stay close. He's always on night duty." Ranger responded by curling up beside the bed and placing his head on his paws with a deep, protective sigh. Lily gave him a tentative smile, small, like a flicker of a match in a snowstorm, but it stayed. That night, Jonah sat in the hallway outside her room, back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of him. He didn't want her to wake and find herself alone. He sipped cold coffee and scrolled through the case notes, then stopped, not on a file, but on a photo. A photo of Sarah Bennett, scanned from her old hospital badge. She had a narrow face, eyes a little too large for comfort, and a tiredness behind her smile that made his throat tighten. She looked like someone who'd smiled for other people more than she ever smiled for herself. And now, she was gone. But her daughter was still here, still breathing, still fighting to trust a world that had failed her. Around 3:30 a.m., Jonah heard soft footsteps. He looked up to see Lily, barefoot and silent, standing in the hallway. Her pajama sleeves hung slightly past her wrists. She didn't speak, but her expression was clear. Jonah opened his arms without a word. She walked to him, sat beside him on the floor, and leaned against his chest. Lacey tucked between them. Ranger shifted slightly, lifting his head, but didn't move otherwise. Jonah wrapped his arm around her shoulders and held her there, close and warm in the quiet dark. Neither of them said anything, but it was the first time she hadn't cried herself to sleep. 6 months had passed since that snow-choked night when Jonah kicked down the door at 74 Willow Lane. Since then, Lakemont had emerged from winter's grip into the quiet hum of summer, with bees flitting lazily through gardens and children chalking crooked rainbows onto driveways. The town had, as it always did, returned to its rhythm, but for one little girl and a retired canine, nothing would ever be the same. At Jonah Reeves' house on Aspen Drive, everything was different and alive. The once quiet home now echoed with soft laughter and hurried footsteps, art supplies scattered across the dining table, and the sweet scent of pancakes on Sunday mornings. In the front yard, a small flower bed bloomed clumsily planted, half crooked, but radiant in color. Lily had chosen each seed herself. She was 7 now. Her hair was longer, usually braided in a lopsided fashion she insisted on doing herself. The shadows under her eyes had lifted, replaced by a bright, watchful curiosity. She still clung to Lacey at times, especially on stormy nights, but now she also carried a sketchbook wherever she went, its pages bursting with color and memory. That morning, Lily sat cross-legged in the living room, tongue poked out in concentration, as she sketched with wax crayons on thick paper. Across from her, Ranger lay on his side, gray now dusting more heavily across his snout and ears. His breathing was slower these days, and his joints stiffened in the mornings, but his eyes remained sharp, especially when they were locked on her. Lily glanced at him, grinned, and leaned over to scratch behind his ear. "I drew you again," she whispered. "You're in the superhero cape this time." Jonah stepped in from the kitchen, a mug of coffee in one hand, a stack of adoption paperwork in the other. He was wearing jeans and a faded flannel, beard a little longer than usual, but his eyes were warmer now, the tension in his shoulders lighter. Life had rebalanced, imperfect but meaningful. "How's the artist this morning?" he asked. Lily held up the picture with pride. The crayon drawing showed a little girl and a German shepherd with a red cape flying above a dark house, stars scattered behind them. Above the picture, she'd written in pink marker, "My real family." Jonah blinked. Something in his chest turned soft. "Hey, that's good timing," he said, setting the mug down and kneeling beside her. "Want to help me sign something important?" She tilted her head. "Like what?" He placed the final page of the adoption papers on the floor and pulled a pen from his shirt pocket. "This makes it official, that you get to stay here. Forever." Lily looked down at the paper, then back up at him. "Like, you're my real dad now?" "If you want me to be," Jonah said. She didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around his neck. "Okay," she whispered. "You already are." Later that day, they walked together to the corner bus stop. Lily's backpack bounced with each step, a bright red one covered in patches and art palette, a lightning bolt, a tiny embroidered ranger face. She wore a mismatched outfit of purple leggings and a yellow t-shirt that said, "Kind is cool." Ranger, ever the guardian, padded slowly beside them, panting slightly in the summer heat but determined to do his job. A boy from her class, Elijah, stood at the stop already. He had a mop of curly black hair, wore thick glasses, and always carried a book about dinosaurs. "Hey, Lily," he said shyly. "Want to sit next to me today?" "Okay," Lily beamed. "But you have to see my drawing first." The bus arrived. Lily gave Ranger a final hug before hopping on board. "She's good," Jonah said, watching her settle into the window seat. "You'd be proud." Ranger sat, tail thumping once. His tongue lolled from his mouth in a satisfied grin. Back at the house, Jonah placed a framed photo on the mantel above the fireplace. It showed Lily and Ranger side by side in the garden, both wearing sunglasses and matching red scarves. Lily's hand rested on Ranger's back. The moment had been silly, joyful, and full of healing. But something else sat beside the photo now. Lily's latest drawing. In it, a tiny version of herself stood at the foot of a large, glowing door. Ranger stood beside her, his body casting a long protective shadow. Behind the door, the night was gone. In its place, sunlight and a house with every window wide open. That evening, as twilight settled and the crickets began their song, Jonah found Lily sitting on the porch steps, arms wrapped around Ranger's neck. "I'm going to write a book one day," she said quietly. "About us, so people know." Jonah sat beside her. "That sounds like a good idea." "He's the reason I talked," Lily said. "No one else heard me, but he did, before I even said it out loud." She leaned her cheek against Ranger's warm side. "You heard me," she whispered, "when no one else did." Ranger didn't move, just blinked slowly, eyes soft and full of something that felt like understanding. He licked her hand once, and in that quiet moment, beneath a sky freckled with stars, in a town that had finally turned its gaze toward something good, a door that had once been closed and locked forever, stood wide open. Sometimes the quietest cries are the ones that need to be heard the most. Lily's voice wasn't loud, but her pain was real. It wasn't the system or even the law that reached her first. It was love. The love of a man who refused to look away, and the loyalty of a dog who listened when no one else did. This story reminds us that miracles don't always come with lightning or thunder. Sometimes they arrive in the shape of a scarred German shepherd and the quiet courage to open a locked door. Maybe you've been in Lily's shoes, maybe you've felt invisible, or maybe just maybe you're meant to be someone else's miracle. Let this story be a reminder that God works through the hearts of those who care, through open doors, faithful friends, and yes, even through a dog who never gave up. If you believe that no child should be forgotten, if you believe that love can heal, if you believe God places the right people and animals in our lives at the right time, then drop an amen in the comments, share this story, subscribe to our channel, and may God bless you and your family with ears that hear, hearts that care, and homes where no door stays closed forever.